welcome, and settle in for a gentle journey through time. Tonight, we're going to explore something rather fascinating yet soothing, the quiet revolution of historical understanding that has slowly, methodically corrected centuries of misconceptions about medieval life. Imagine yourself wrapped in the comfort of your own space, as we venture back to a time that has been profoundly misunderstood. The Middle Ages, that 1,000-year span of human history, has been painted with broad strokes of darkness and ignorance for far too long. But archaeological discoveries, careful manuscript studies, and patient scholarly work have been quietly dismantling these myths, one gentle revelation at a time. You might find it oddly comforting to know that much of what we once believed about medieval people, their supposed filth, their imagined ignorance, their presumed brutality, has been gradually peacefully corrected by evidence emerging from the very ground they once walked upon. Tonight, we'll let these quiet discoveries wash over us like a gentle tide, carrying away the harsh judgments of previous centuries and replacing them with a softer, more nuanced understanding of how our ancestors truly lived. The rhythm of discovery and historical research moves slowly, deliberately, much like the medieval life we're about to explore. There is something deeply restful about this methodical correction of long-held assumptions, the way truth emerges not through dramatic revelation, but through the patient accumulation of small details, fragments of pottery, traces of soap residue, worn pages of carefully preserved manuscripts. As we drift through these four interconnected stories of myth and reality, allow your mind to settle into the steady pace of historical truth-telling. Let the gentle correction of old misconceptions carry you into a state of peaceful contemplation, where the boundary between past and present softens, and the simple human experiences of our medieval ancestors become as familiar and comforting as your own daily routines. For centuries, the image has persisted with stubborn tenacity. Medieval people as unwashed masses, living in their own filth, ignorant of even the most basic concepts of cleanliness. This vision, painted in the imaginations of later generations, conjures scenes of mud-caked peasants who never encountered soap, of nobles who masked their stench with perfumes, of entire communities resigned to lives of perpetual grime. But imagine yourself walking through an actual medieval village or a typical morning, and let the archaeological evidence gently guide your senses toward a very different reality. The air carries scents that would surprise those who believe in medieval filth, not the overwhelming stench of unwashed bodies, but rather the complex aromatics of a working community. Wood smoke mingles with the herbal fragrances drifting from cottage gardens, where lavender, rosemary, and mint grow in carefully tended plots. These weren't mere decorations, but essential components of medieval hygiene, their oils extracted and mixed into soaps and washing solutions with a knowledge passed down through generations. You would hear the sound of water, the constant, rhythmic presence of streams being diverted into settlements, not just for drinking and cooking, but for the essential daily practice of washing. Archaeological excavations have revealed an intricate network of water management systems in medieval towns, with public fountains, private wells, and even primitive sewage systems that speak to a sophisticated understanding of sanitation. The morning routine in a medieval household reveals itself through the patient work of archaeologists who have uncovered the small, telling artifacts of daily cleanliness. Clay vessels, worn smooth from use, that once held herbal washing solutions. Combs made of bone and wood, their teeth worn from constant use. Bronze tweezers for removing splinters and maintaining personal grooming. These objects, found in houses from the humblest cottages to the grandest manors, tell a story of people deeply concerned with personal hygiene. Picture the medieval housewife beginning her day, and here, the archaeological record becomes remarkably specific and comforting in its detail. She rises in a linen undergarment that, contrary to popular myth, was changed and washed regularly. Linen, we now know from textile analyses, was prized precisely because it could withstand frequent washing, and the wear patterns on recovered medieval clothing show clear evidence of regular laundering. She walks to her washing station, perhaps a wooden tub, reinforced with iron bands, or a stone basin carved specifically for personal bathing. The water has been warming since before dawn, heated in large cauldrons over carefully maintained fires. This wasn't an occasional luxury, but a daily necessity, as evidenced by the heating systems and water storage facilities found in virtually every excavated medieval dwelling. The soap she uses would seem remarkably familiar to modern sensibilities, yet wonderfully exotic in its herbal complexity. Medieval soap recipes, preserved in manuscripts and confirmed through chemical analysis of residues found at archaeological sites, reveal sophisticated understanding of saponification, the process of turning fats and oils into cleansing agents. These weren't harsh, industrial substances, but gentle, aromatic compounds made from olive oil, animal fats, and ash from carefully selected plants. Imagine the texture of this medieval soap in your hands, smooth and slightly oily, scented with lavender harvested from the cottage garden, or perhaps rosemary gathered from the hillsides. The lather would be soft and creamy, nothing like the harsh, stripping sensation that later myths would suggest medieval people endured. Chemical analysis of soap residues has revealed that medieval soap makers understood the importance of superfat, leaving excess oils in their soaps to protect and moisturize the skin. The bathhouse, perhaps the most dramatically misunderstood institution of medieval life, emerges from archaeological evidence as a sophisticated social center of cleanliness and community. Far from being rare or exclusive, bathhouses were common features of medieval towns, their remains found in virtually every excavated settlement of significant size. Enter one of these establishments in your imagination, guided by the careful reconstructions archaeologists have made from foundation stones, drainage systems, and artifact assemblages. The building would be warm and steamy, filled with the gentle sound of flowing water and quiet conversation. Stone-lined pools, their surfaces smooth from centuries of use, contained water at different temperatures, cold pools for invigorating rinses, warm pools for leisurely soaking, hot pools for therapeutic bathing. The social aspects of medieval bathing become clear through documentary evidence that archaeologists have carefully correlated with physical remains. Bathing wasn't a solitary, shameful activity hidden from view, but a communal experience that reinforced social bonds and community hygiene standards. Families bathed together, neighbors shared bathhouse visits, and even the church, far from condemning cleanliness, often sponsored public bathhouses as acts of charitable duty. The aromatics of the medieval bathhouse would envelop you in a cloud of herbal steam. Rose petals floated in the bathing pools, their essence released into the warm water. Sachets of dried herbs, a chamomile for its soothing properties, mint for its invigorating scent, lavender for relaxation, were hung around the bathing areas, creating an atmosphere that was part medical treatment, part social gathering, part spiritual cleansing. Let your mind drift into the gentle rhythm of medieval hair care, revealed through the analysis of combs, hairpins, and grooming implements found in archaeological contexts. Women's hair was not the matted, neglected mass that later myths suggested, but carefully maintained, regularly washed with herbal shampoos, and styled with techniques that required considerable skill and time investment. The combs themselves tell a story of vanity and care that contradicts every stereotype of medieval neglect. Made from precious materials, ivory, rare woods, precious metals, these weren't utilitarian objects grabbed in haste, but treasured possessions that families passed down through generations. The wear patterns on recovered combs show daily use, their teeth polished smooth from constant contact with clean, well-maintained hair. Medieval dental hygiene reveals another layer of sophisticated self-care. Toothbrushes made from frayed twigs, their bristles softened through careful preparation, have been found in graves alongside their owners. Tooth powders, made from ground herbs and abrasive stones, were stored in small containers that show evidence of regular use. Even toothpicks, carved from precious woods and sometimes decorated with silver or gold, demonstrate that medieval people took oral hygiene seriously enough to treat dental instruments as personal ornaments. The clothing worn by medieval people, when subjected to modern textile analysis, reveals laundering techniques that were remarkably effective and surprisingly gentle. The linen undergarments that formed the base layer of medieval dress show wear patterns consistent with frequent washing, while the outer garments, wool tunics, leather accessories, silk decorations, show evidence of careful spot cleaning and maintenance. The process of medieval laundry becomes visible through the archaeological record of washing stones, soap residues, and drainage systems designed specifically for clothes washing. Picture the medieval laundry process unfolding in gentle, methodical stages. Clothes soaked in wooden tubs filled with warm, soapy water. Scrub it against smooth river stones that have been worn into perfect washing tools through generations of use. Rinsed in clean, running water that carries away the dirt and soap. Dried on wooden frames or stone walls that maximize sun exposure while protecting the fabric from harsh weather. The herbs used in medieval laundry weren't just for pleasant scent, but for practical purposes that modern detergent manufacturers have only recently rediscovered. Soapwort, found growing wild near virtually every medieval settlement, contains natural saponins that create a gentle, effective cleaning action. Lavender and rosemary weren't just pleasant additions to the wash water, but natural antibacterial agents that help prevent the growth of harmful microorganisms in stored clothing. As we drift deeper into this reimagined medieval world, the evidence for sophisticated hygiene practices continues to accumulate with gentle persistence. Public latrine systems, far from being crude affairs, were engineered with remarkable sophistication. Stone seats, carefully carved for comfort, positioned over flowing water systems that carried waste away from populated areas. Private toilet facilities in wealthier homes, complete with early forms of toilet paper made from soft fabrics or specially prepared leaves. The medieval understanding of disease transmission, while different from our modern germ theory, nonetheless led to practical hygiene measures that were remarkably effective. The association between cleanliness and health was deeply embedded in medieval culture, expressed through religious teachings that equated physical cleanliness with spiritual purity, but also through practical medical advice that recognized the connection between sanitation and well-being. Let yourself sink into the gentle rhythm of a medieval evening bathing routine, reconstructed from the patient accumulation of archaeological details. The day's work finished, the evening meal concluded, the medieval household turns to the restorative ritual of personal cleansing. Warm water, scented with herbs from the day's garden work, fills wooden tubs that have been warmed near the hearth fire. The process unfolds with methodical care. First, the removal of outer garments, carefully folded and stored to prevent unnecessary soiling. Then the washing of hands and face with soap that releases the day's accumulation of herbal scents. Finally, the full bathing ritual, accompanied by the gentle scraping of wooden strigils against skin that emerges clean and oil-soft from the herbal bath. Even hair washing becomes a meditative practice in this reconstructed medieval world. Herbal shampoos, made from saponin-rich plants and scented with garden herbs, are worked through hair that is then rinsed with warm water poured from pitchers heated specifically for this purpose. The hair is combed while damp, using precious combs that have been warmed near the fire, then dried near the hearth while the household settles into the evening's quiet activities. The persistence of the filthy medieval myth begins to seem not just wrong, but almost cruel in its dismissal of human dignity and ingenuity. These were people who understood that cleanliness contributed to health, comfort, and social acceptance. They developed sophisticated techniques for personal hygiene using the materials available to them, and they embedded these practices so deeply into their daily routines that the archaeological record preserves their evidence centuries later. The gentle correction of this historical misconception offers something deeply comforting: the recognition that humans across time and culture have shared similar desires for cleanliness, comfort, and dignity in their daily lives. The medieval villager washing her face in herbal-scented water at dawn, the craftsman soaking tired muscles in the communal bathhouse after work, the noble lady combing precious oils through carefully maintained hair. These images replace the harsh stereotypes with something softer, more humane, more recognizably connected to our own experiences of self-care and daily maintenance. As this first exploration of medieval myth and reality draws to a gentle close, let the evidence wash over you like the warm, herbal-scented bathwater of a medieval evening. The archaeological record speaks with quiet authority, correcting centuries of misconception with the patient accumulation of small, human details, soap residues and worn combs, bathing pools and drainage systems, herbal preparations and textile wear patterns. The rhythm of this correction mirrors the rhythm of the medieval life itself, steady, methodical, deeply rooted in practical wisdom and human dignity. As we prepare to drift into our next exploration of medieval myths, carry with you this softer vision of the past, where cleanliness wasn't unknown, but carefully cultivated, where hygiene wasn't ignored, but thoughtfully practiced, where the supposed filth of the Middle Ages dissolves into the archaeological reality of people living with care, dignity, and surprising sophistication in their daily attention to personal cleanliness. The image is so deeply embedded in our collective imagination that it seems almost sacrilegious to question it. The fierce Viking warrior, blonde braids streaming from beneath a magnificent horned helmet, charging into battle with supernatural ferocity. This vision has dominated our understanding of Norse culture for over a century, reproduced in countless films, books, and artistic representations. Yet perhaps there's something oddly comforting in discovering that this iconic image, like so many of our most cherished historical assumptions, dissolves under the gentle scrutiny of archaeological evidence. Let yourself drift back to the moment when this myth began its quiet journey toward correction, in the methodical world of 19th century archaeology. Picture the early excavators, working with careful precision through the burial mounds and settlement sites of Scandinavia, their expectations shaped by the romantic artistic interpretations of their era. They were looking for horned helmets. These patient scholars, convinced that such magnificent artifacts must surely exist in the graves of history's most fearsome warriors. The silence of the archaeological record speaks with remarkable eloquence on this matter. Across centuries of careful excavation, through hundreds of Viking-era graves, burial sites, and settlement remains, the horned helmet remains conspicuously absent. This absence isn't merely the result of poor preservation or incomplete excavation. It represents a systematic, comprehensive lack of evidence that has accumulated with the steady persistence of scientific truth. Instead, the helmets that emerge from Viking graves tell a very different story, one of practical military engineering and surprisingly sophisticated metallurgy. Imagine yourself examining one of these authentic Viking helmets, your hands guided by the patient expertise of archaeologists who have spent careers studying these precious artifacts. The helmet that rests before you is the famous Jomund helmet, discovered in 1943 in a Norwegian burial site and dating to the 10th century. Its form would surprise anyone expecting horned magnificence. This is a piece of functional military equipment, crafted with remarkable skill, but designed for survival rather than spectacle. The iron construction shows evidence of sophisticated forging techniques, with individual plates carefully shaped and joined to create maximum protection, while maintaining reasonable weight. Run your fingers along its smooth, practical curves in your imagination. The helmet follows the natural contours of the human skull, its rounded shape designed to deflect blows rather than catch them. There are no projecting horns to provide convenient handholds for enemies, no decorative elements that might compromise the wearer's peripheral vision or balance during combat. This is the work of craftsmen who understood that in actual battle, function must always triumph over form. The eye protection reveals itself as particularly sophisticated, not the crude eye holes that popular imagination might suggest, but carefully calculated openings that maximized vision while protecting the vulnerable orbital area. The nasal guard, extending down to protect the nose and upper lip, shows wear patterns that speak of actual use in combat situations. This wasn't ceremonial armor stored away for special occasions, but working equipment that saw real battlefield service. Let your mind drift into the workshop where such helmets were created, guided by the evidence of smithing tools and metalworking debris found at Viking archaeological sites. The process unfolds with methodical precision, iron heated to precise temperatures in furnaces that archaeologists have reconstructed from foundation stones and slag deposits. The metal shaped through patient hammer work, each blow calculated to maintain the correct thickness and curvature. The joining of individual plates accomplished through techniques that required years of training to master. The mystery of the horned helmet myth begins to unravel when we trace its origins through the gentler realm of artistic history rather than archaeological evidence. The trail leads us to 19th century Romantic nationalism, that cultural movement that sought to create heroic mythologies for emerging nation-states. Artists and writers of this period, working centuries after the Viking Age had ended, created visual representations based not on historical evidence, but on dramatic effect. Picture the studio of a 19th century historical painter, perhaps working on one of the grand mythological scenes that were so popular during this period. The artist faces a creative challenge: how to make Viking warriors visually distinct from other medieval fighters, how to create an image that would capture the imagination and convey the supposed savagery of these northern raiders. The horned helmet emerges as an inspired artistic solution, drawing on much earlier Celtic and Germanic ceremonial objects that had little connection to actual Viking military equipment. The persistence of this artistic invention was something fascinating about how historical myths propagate through culture. The horned helmet image, once created for dramatic effect, began to reproduce itself across different artistic media with remarkable tenacity. It appeared in illustrations for popular histories, was adopted by costume designers for theatrical productions, and eventually became so ubiquitous that people began to assume it must be based on historical fact. Richard Wagner's epic opera cycle Der Ring des Nibelungen, first performed in the 1870s, played a crucial role in cementing the horned helmet image of popular consciousness. The costume designs for these productions, created for maximum theatrical impact, featured elaborate horned helmets that became the visual template for how audiences imagined Viking warriors should look. The irony, of course, is that Wagner's operas were based on Germanic mythology rather than historical Viking culture, but the visual language created for the stage began to influence how people understood actual history. Drift into the quiet halls of museums, where authentic Viking artifacts rest in climate-controlled cases, their simple functionality contrasting sharply with the elaborate fantasies of popular culture. The real Viking military equipment reveals a culture that valued effectiveness over ostentation, practicality over dramatic gesture. Swords with plain, serviceable hilts that show evidence of repeated sharpening and repair. Shields constructed from lightweight wood and leather, designed to be maneuverable rather than impressive. Spearheads that prioritize penetrating power over decorative appeal. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of Viking warfare that is both more complex and more human than the horned helmet mythology suggests. These were professional warriors, certainly, but also farmers, traders, and craftsmen who understood that survival in combat depended on superior equipment and tactical skill rather than intimidating appearance. Consider the practical realities of Viking combat as revealed through careful analysis of weapons and battlefield archaeology. Fighting typically occurred in close formation, where projecting horns on helmets would interfere with the coordinated movements essential for group combat effectiveness. The shield wall, that fundamental Viking battle tactic, required warriors to stand shoulder to shoulder in tight formation. Horned helmets would make such close coordination literally impossible. The weight distribution of a horned helmet would create severe problems for a warrior engaged in extended combat. Archaeological analysis of authentic Viking helmets reveals careful attention to balance, with the weight distributed to minimize neck strain during long battles. Adding substantial horn projections would shift the center of gravity forward, creating fatigue and reducing the warrior's ability to maintain proper head position for optimal vision and balance. Even more fundamentally, horned helmets would provide enemies with convenient handholds during the grappling that was an inevitable part of medieval combat. A warrior wearing projecting horns could easily find his head immobilized by an opponent who grabbed the horns, leaving him helpless and vulnerable to fatal attack. No competent warrior would voluntarily handicap himself with such a dangerous design flaw. The gentle correction of the horned helmet myth offers insights into the actual sophistication of Viking material culture. The real helmets found in archaeological contexts reveal a society with advanced metallurgical knowledge, sophisticated understanding of engineering principles, and highly developed craft traditions. The Jumandbu helmet, for instance, shows evidence of complex heat treatment techniques that improve the iron's durability while maintaining workability. The decoration that did exist on Viking military equipment was subtle and functional rather than ostentatious and impractical. Silver wire inlays on sword hilts served to improve grip while adding aesthetic appeal. Intricate pattern welding on blade construction created both visual beauty and superior mechanical properties in the finished weapon. These were people who understood that true craftsmanship lay in the seamless integration of function and form. Let your imagination drift into a Viking longhouse on a winter evening, where warriors maintain their equipment by firelight. The scene unfolds with methodical care, leather helmet linings being oiled to maintain flexibility, iron surfaces being treated with protective compounds to prevent rust, straps and buckles being checked for wear that might lead to equipment failure at a crucial moment. The social aspects of Viking military culture emerged through careful analysis of burial practices and grave goods. Warriors were buried with their actual equipment, not ceremonial substitutes, suggesting that their arms and armor held deep personal significance. The wear patterns on these burial weapons tell stories of individual lives, swords that show evidence of numerous combats, helmets that bear the marks of deflected blows, shields that have been repaired multiple times through their working life. The absence of horned helmets in this funerary context becomes particularly significant. If such helmets had been important symbols of warrior status, they would certainly appear in the graves of high-status Viking fighters. Instead, the burial record consistently shows the same practical, functional equipment that archaeological analysis reveals was actually used in combat. The mythology of Viking appearance extends beyond helmets to encompass their entire material culture, much of which has been similarly romanticized by later artistic interpretation. The reality revealed through archaeological evidence presents a more complex and arguably more interesting picture. A society that valued craftsmanship, understood the principles of effective design, and created objects of subtle beauty that served practical purposes with remarkable efficiency. As we drift away from the corrected mythology of Viking military equipment, the archaeological evidence settles around us like a gentle tide, washing away the dramatic fantasies and revealing something more substantial underneath. The real Vikings emerge as sophisticated craftspeople and practical warriors, their culture rich in authentic achievements that need no fictional embellishment to capture our imagination. The quiet satisfaction of this mythological correction is not in deflating heroic fantasies, but in discovering that reality possesses its own deep fascination. The Jumandbu helmet, with its elegant functionality and sophisticated construction, tells a more compelling story than any horned fantasy could achieve. It speaks of human ingenuity, cultural sophistication, and the eternal challenge of balancing practical necessity with aesthetic aspiration. The rhythm of archaeological discovery continues its patient work. Each excavation sees and adding new details to our understanding of Viking material culture. Textile fragments reveal sophisticated dyeing techniques and complex weaving patterns. Jewelry demonstrates mastery of intricate metalworking methods. Household objects show attention to both utility and beauty that contradict simplified stereotypes of Viking culture. In the gentle silence that follows the debunking of the horned helmet myth, we're left with something more valuable than dramatic fiction, an authentic glimpse into a culture that created objects of lasting beauty and practical excellence, whose true achievements far exceed the limitations of romantic fantasy. The archaeological record speaks with quiet authority, correcting centuries of misconception with the patient accumulation of physical evidence, each artifact a small but definitive voice in the ongoing conversation between myth and historical reality. Perhaps no misconception about medieval thought has proven more persistent or more comforting to modern sensibilities than the belief that our ancestors lived in ignorant terror of sailing off the edge of a flat world. This vision of medieval cosmology, complete with dragons lurking at the world's rim and ships tumbling into cosmic void, has become so embedded in our understanding of the past that questioning it feels almost like disturbing a pleasant dream. Yet there's something deeply soothing in discovering that this particular historical myth dissolves under examination, morning mist in sunlight, revealing beneath it a medieval intellectual landscape far more sophisticated and scientifically aware than popular imagination has allowed. Let yourself drift into the scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, those quiet centers of learning where the actual cosmological understanding of the Middle Ages was carefully preserved in manuscript after manuscript. Picture the gentle scratch of quills on parchment, the soft rustle of pages being turned, the concentrated silence of scholars engaged in the patient work of copying and preserving ancient wisdom. The manuscripts themselves speak with quiet authority against the flat earth myth. Document after document, from the earliest medieval periods through the height of the Middle Ages, reveals a scholarly consensus that the earth is spherical. This wasn't controversial knowledge hidden in secret texts, but standard educational material taught in cathedral schools and monasteries across Europe. Imagine yourself examining one of these precious manuscripts in the hushed atmosphere of a modern medieval studies library. The etymologies of Isidore of Seville, written in the early 7th century, rests open before you under carefully controlled lighting. Your eyes trace the Latin text that matter-of-factly describes the Earth as a sphere, supported by classical authorities and astronomical observation. This wasn't revolutionary thinking for its time, but accepted scholarly orthodoxy. The visual evidence proves even more compelling than the textual. Medieval maps and diagrams, when examined in their original contexts, rather than through the filter of later misconceptions, reveal a sophisticated understanding of global geography. The famous TO maps that appear in countless medieval manuscripts have been misinterpreted by modern observers as evidence of flat earth thinking, but they were actually simplified teaching diagrams, not literal representations of cosmological belief. Picture yourself studying a medieval mappamundi, perhaps the magnificent Hereford map created around 1300. The circular format might initially suggest a flat earth conception, but closer examination reveals something quite different. The map is clearly intended as a projection of a spherical world onto a flat surface, the medieval equivalent of our modern map projections, with all the distortions and compromises that such representations require. The edges of these medieval world maps don't show the cosmic void or dragon-infested waters of popular imagination, but rather the careful notation, Hic sunt leones, here are lions, indicating unexplored territories known to exist, but not yet mapped in detail. This represents genuine geographical uncertainty, not cosmological confusion about the nature of the Earth itself. Let your mind drift into a medieval classroom where the quadrivium d'arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy forms the advanced curriculum for serious students. Astronomy, as taught in these medieval institutions, was based firmly on classical sources that had never lost sight of the Earth's spherical nature. Students worked through complex calculations of planetary movements, lunar eclipses, and seasonal variations that would have been impossible without understanding the Earth as a sphere moving through space. The treatises on astronomy produced by medieval scholars reveal mathematical sophistication that contradicts every stereotype of medieval ignorance. Consider the work of Johannes de Sacrobosco, whose treatise on the sphere became the standard astronomy textbook for universities across Europe in the 13th century. This wasn't elementary material, but advanced mathematical astronomy that treated the spherical Earth as a fundamental given requiring no special proof or justification. The practical implications of medieval spherical Earth understanding emerge through careful study of navigation techniques and geographical knowledge. Medieval sailors didn't fear falling off the edge of the world. They understood latitude and longitude concepts, used astrolabe calculations based on spherical geometry, and planned voyages using geographical knowledge that assumed a round Earth. Picture a medieval ship's navigator at work, perhaps aboard one of the vessels that regularly sailed between northern Europe and the Mediterranean. His instruments, astrolabe, compass, and carefully maintained charts, all operate on principles that require spherical Earth geometry. The calculations he performs to determine his position would yield nonsensical results if based on flat Earth assumptions. The intellectual foundations of medieval spherical Earth knowledge reach back through an unbroken chain of scholarly transmission to classical antiquity. The works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and other ancient authorities had never been lost to medieval scholarship, though they had sometimes become difficult to access during periods of political instability. When these classical texts were more systematically recovered and translated during the 12th century Renaissance, they confirmed and expanded knowledge that had never entirely disappeared. Let yourself settle into the atmosphere of the palace school at Orcon in the Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries, where Alcuin of York and other scholars created educational programs that explicitly included spherical Earth geography in their standard curriculum. These weren't secret teachings reserved for an intellectual elite, but fundamental knowledge considered necessary for any educated person. The manuscripts produced during this period reveal casual, matter-of-fact references to the Earth's spherical nature. Commentary on biblical texts that mention the four corners of the Earth carefully explain that this is metaphorical language, not literal geographical description. Treatises on calendar calculation assume spherical Earth geometry as a basic prerequisite for understanding seasonal variations and festival dating. The myth of medieval flat Earth belief appears to be largely a creation of 19th century historians who projected their own assumptions about medieval ignorance back onto the historical record. These scholars, working during a period of rapid scientific advancement, apparently found it convenient to believe that their medieval predecessors had been correspondingly ignorant, creating a dramatic contrast that emphasized their own intellectual superiority. The most influential propagator of the flat Earth myth was probably Washington Irving, whose fictionalized biography of Christopher Columbus, published in 1828, painted a vivid picture of medieval scholars terrified by Columbus's plans to sail west into the unknown. This dramatic narrative, though entertaining, was almost entirely fictional. The real historical objections to Columbus's voyage were based on accurate calculations of the Earth's circumference, not fear of sailing off a flat edge. Imagine yourself in the actual historical context of Columbus's proposals to the Spanish court, guided by surviving documentary evidence rather than Irving's romantic fiction. The scholars who questioned Columbus's plans weren't ignorant flat earthers, but knowledgeable geographers who correctly understood that the Earth was much larger than Columbus claimed, making his proposed westward route to Asia impractically long given the limitations of 15th century navigation and ship provisioning. The real intellectual debate surrounding Columbus's voyage centered on competing calculations of the Earth's circumference, sophisticated mathematical questions that assumed spherical Earth geometry throughout. Some scholars favored the more accurate calculations of Eratosthenes, while Columbus himself relied on the smaller measurements of Ptolemy and certain Islamic geographers. All parties to the debate understood perfectly well that the Earth was round. The gentle correction of the flat Earth myth reveals the true sophistication of medieval geographical knowledge. Medieval scholars not only understood that the Earth was spherical, but had developed remarkably accurate methods for measuring its size and mapping its surface. The mathematical techniques they used for cartography and navigation were sophisticated enough to support the age of exploration that followed. Let your mind drift through the libraries of medieval universities, Paris, Oxford, Bologna, where manuscripts on astronomical and geographical subjects were carefully preserved and continuously studied. The margins of these texts show evidence of active scholarly engagement, notes comparing different authorities, calculations updating ancient measurements with more recent observations, diagrams illustrating complex geometrical relationships. The instruments used by medieval astronomers and navigators tell their own story of sophisticated scientific understanding. Astrolabes, those intricate brass computers of the medieval world, operate entirely on spherical Earth principles. The mathematical relationships encoded in their design would produce meaningless results if the Earth were flat. Yet these instruments were common enough that craftsmen in major cities specialized in their manufacture, suggesting widespread familiarity with their underlying principles. The practical applications of medieval spherical Earth knowledge extended beyond navigation to architecture, agriculture, and timekeeping. Cathedral builders used astronomical knowledge to orient their structures precisely. Farmers planned planting seasons based on sophisticated calendar calculations, and clockmakers created mechanical timepieces that accounted for seasonal variations in daylight hours, all applications that require understanding the Earth's spherical nature and orbital mechanics. Consider the magnificent Gothic cathedrals that rose across medieval Europe, their construction requiring mathematical knowledge of extraordinary precision. The astronomical alignments built into these structures, windows positioned to illuminate specific altars on particular feast days, facades oriented to catch the light of important stars, demonstrate practical application of spherical Earth astronomy on a grand scale. The agricultural treatises of the medieval period reveal another dimension of practical geographical knowledge. Farming manuals included detailed discussions of seasonal variations, planting calendars that accounted for latitude differences, and irrigation techniques that assumed understanding of how water behaves on a curved Earth surface. This wasn't theoretical knowledge, but practical wisdom applied daily by countless farmers across medieval Europe. The monastic timekeeping that regulated medieval daily life depended on astronomical calculations of considerable complexity. The canonical hours, the 8-day prayer times that structured monastic routine, were calculated using methods that required understanding seasonal variations in daylight, which in turn demanded spherical Earth geometry. The mechanical clocks that gradually appeared in medieval cities represented the culmination of centuries of careful astronomical observation and mathematical calculation. As we drift deeper into the corrected understanding of medieval cosmology, the evidence accumulates with gentle persistence. Manuscript after manuscript, instrument after instrument, architectural monument after architectural monument, all testifying to a culture that understood perfectly well that the Earth was round, that had developed sophisticated methods for measuring and mapping its surface, and that applied this knowledge in countless practical applications. The rhythm of scholarly discovery continues to correct the flat Earth myth with patient accumulation of evidence. Each newly examined manuscript, each careful reanalysis of medieval astronomical instruments, each contextual study of medieval geographical knowledge adds another piece to the picture of intellectual sophistication that contradicts romantic notions of medieval ignorance. The comfort of this correction is not merely in setting the record straight, but in recognizing the continuity of human intellectual achievement across the centuries. The medieval scholars who carefully copied and preserved classical astronomical knowledge, who made their own observations and calculations, who taught spherical Earth geography to students across Europe. These were our intellectual ancestors, maintaining and advancing the scientific tradition that connects ancient wisdom to modern understanding. Let the gentle tide of corrected historical understanding carry away the harsh stereotypes of medieval ignorance, revealing instead a culture of careful observation, mathematical sophistication, and scientific curiosity that deserves recognition rather than caricature. The medieval world, as it emerges from careful scholarly examination, was neither the age of darkness that Enlightenment historians imagined, nor the romantic fantasy that later centuries projected back onto it, but a complex civilization with its own distinctive achievements in the long human quest to understand the natural world. The manuscripts rest in their climate-controlled cases. The instruments display their brass precision under museum lights. The cathedrals continue their silent testimony to astronomical knowledge applied in stone, all bearing quiet witness to the sophisticated geographical understanding that medieval people took for granted, and that we have slowly, carefully, gently recovered from beneath centuries of accumulated misconception. In the popular imagination, medieval libraries present a vision of knowledge imprisoned, rows of books bound in heavy chains, locked away from common people, jealously guarded by suspicious monks who viewed learning as a dangerous privilege to be rationed like precious grain during famine. This image has become so pervasive that it shapes our understanding of medieval intellectual culture, painting a picture of deliberate ignorance enforced by ecclesiastical authority. Yet there's something profoundly peaceful in discovering that this vision, like so many of our assumptions about medieval life, dissolves under careful examination into something far more humane and intellectually generous. The chains that bound medieval books tell a very different story when we allow the archaeological and documentary evidence to speak with its quiet, patient voice. Let yourself drift into the hushed atmosphere of a medieval monastery library, but set aside the stereotypes of hardened knowledge and suspicious guardians. Instead, imagine entering a space that represented one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated information preservation and distribution systems, where the chains that secured precious manuscripts were not instruments of intellectual oppression, but practical solutions to the fundamental problem of protecting irreplaceable cultural treasures. Picture the gentle morning light filtering through the tall windows of the library at the Abbey of St. Denis, or perhaps the magnificent collection at the Monastery of St. Gall, where the scriptoriums and libraries worked in harmonious cooperation to preserve and disseminate the intellectual heritage of both classical antiquity and Christian scholarship. The atmosphere would strike you immediately as one of reverence for learning rather than suspicion of it. The books themselves, when you examine them in this corrected historical context, reveal their true nature as objects of almost unimaginable value and cultural significance. Each volume represents not merely the cost of parchment and ink, but hundreds of hours of skilled labor, the careful preparation of writing surfaces, the painstaking copying of text in scripts that required years to master, the illumination and decoration that transformed utilitarian objects into works of art. Consider the economic realities that made these chains necessary and comprehensible. A single large biblical manuscript might represent the equivalent of a peasant family's entire annual income, or the cost of maintaining several monks for a full year. The smaller volumes, treatises on astronomy, copies of classical authors, collections of canon law, each represented weeks or months of concentrated scholarly labor. In modern terms, each chained book in a medieval library had a replacement value comparable to a luxury automobile. The chains themselves, when examined with archaeological precision, reveal sophisticated understanding of security technology adapted specifically for library use. These weren't crude restraints hammered together by suspicious guardians, but carefully engineered systems designed to allow maximum access while providing necessary protection. The chain attachments were positioned to permit books to be opened fully and comfortably read, while preventing their removal from the library premises. Let your imagination settle into the daily rhythm of a medieval library in active use, guided by surviving administrative records and contemporary descriptions. The scene that unfolds contradicts every stereotype of hardened knowledge and restricted access. Scholars move quietly between the reading desks, consulting multiple volumes in their research, copying passages into their own notebooks, engaging in the scholarly conversations that medieval manuscripts record in their marginal annotations. The reading desks themselves, reconstructed from archaeological evidence and surviving examples, reveal furniture designed specifically to facilitate comfortable study. These weren't crude lecterns cobbled together from available materials, but sophisticated pieces of scholarly furniture, angled to reduce eye strain, equipped with bookstands that held volumes at optimal reading angles, furnished with writing surfaces for note-taking and copying. The chain system integrated seamlessly with this scholarly furniture, allowing readers to position books for comfortable study while maintaining security. The chains were long enough to permit volumes to be laid flat for detailed examination, moved from desk to desk for comparative study, or positioned to catch optimal light from windows or candles. The system represented a carefully considered balance between access and protection. The social dynamics of medieval library use emerged through careful study of surviving borrowing records, visitor accounts, and institutional regulations. Far from being exclusive preserves for a scholarly elite, medieval libraries actively encouraged use by qualified readers from far beyond their immediate communities. Traveling scholars were welcomed, local clergy were granted access, even educated laypeople might receive permission to consult specific texts. Picture the international character of medieval scholarly culture as it manifested in these chained libraries. A monk from Ireland might travel to consult manuscripts at Chartres, carrying letters of introduction that would grant him access to precious texts unavailable in his home monastery. A scholar from Bologna might spend weeks at St. Denis, copying legal texts that would be carried back to Italy and incorporated into new scholarly works. The preservation work that made this scholarly exchange possible reveals itself through examination of surviving manuscripts and the scriptorial records that document their creation. The chained libraries weren't passive repositories of ancient wisdom, but active centers of textual preservation and reproduction. Scribes worked constantly to create new copies of important texts, ensuring that valuable knowledge wouldn't be lost if individual manuscripts were damaged or destroyed. The illuminated manuscripts that represent the pinnacle of medieval book production take on new significance in this context. These weren't ostentatious displays of wealth hoarded by selfish institutions, but sophisticated teaching tools designed to make complex information accessible to medieval readers. The elaborate diagrams, decorative initials, and illustrative programs served pedagogical purposes, helping readers navigate complex texts and understand difficult concepts. Let yourself drift into the atmosphere of a medieval scriptorium during the busy morning hours when the day's copying work began. The gentle scratch of quills on parchment, the soft conversations between scribes consulting about difficult passages, the quiet footsteps of the librarian checking on the progress of important copying projects. This was the sound of knowledge being actively preserved and disseminated rather than jealously hoarded. The technological sophistication of medieval manuscript production becomes apparent through careful examination of surviving examples. The ink formulations that have preserved their clarity for centuries, the binding techniques that have kept fragile parchment pages intact through decades of heavy use, the organizational systems that made complex multi-volume works accessible to readers, all represent solutions to practical problems that medieval scholars approached with remarkable ingenuity. The catalog systems developed by medieval libraries reveal another dimension of intellectual sophistication, often overlooked in popular discussions of chained books. These weren't random collections assembled without system, but carefully organized repositories with detailed finding aids, cross-reference systems, and lending protocols that would seem familiar to any modern librarian. Consider the magnificent catalogue created for the Library of the Sorbonne in the 13th century, which listed not only the contents of each volume, but also its location, condition, and availability for consultation. This represents information management on a scale that contradicts every stereotype of medieval intellectual primitiveness. The educational programs that medieval libraries supported extend the contradiction of the hoarded knowledge myth even further. These institutions didn't merely preserve books for their own sake, but actively used their collections to support teaching programs that educated thousands of students across medieval Europe. The universities that emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries depended entirely on the scholarly resources that monastic and cathedral libraries had been carefully accumulating for centuries. The manuscript annotations that fill the margins of surviving medieval books provide intimate glimpses into this active scholarly culture. Reader after reader has left traces of their intellectual engagement, corrections to the text, cross-references to other works, personal observations that reveal deep understanding of complex material. These annotations represent a scholarly conversation that continued across centuries, with each generation of readers contributing to the ongoing interpretation of important texts. Let your mind settle into the evening quietude of a medieval library, when the day's formal activities have concluded, but dedicated scholars continue their research by candlelight. The atmosphere would be one of profound intellectual satisfaction, the pleasure of minds engaged with important questions, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, working within a tradition that valued learning for its own sake. The practical applications of medieval library scholarship themselves, through the survival of countless treatises, commentaries, and original works that emerged from these supposedly restrictive institutions. Medieval monasteries produced advances in agriculture, architecture, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and theology that shaped European intellectual development for centuries. The preservation crisis that made chained libraries necessary provides crucial context for understanding their true significance. Medieval Europe faced constant threats to its intellectual heritage: Viking raids that destroyed entire monasteries, political instability that scattered scholarly communities, fires that could eliminate centuries of accumulated learning in a single night. The chains that secured precious manuscripts were one element in a comprehensive preservation strategy that successfully maintained European intellectual continuity through centuries of political and social upheaval. The international character of medieval scholarly culture becomes even more apparent when we examine the networks of manuscript exchange that connected libraries across vast distances. A text copied in Ireland might find its way to monasteries in Germany, Italy, and Spain, creating multiple preservation copies that ensured survival even if individual libraries were destroyed. This represents information distribution on a continental scale, accomplished entirely through the voluntary cooperation of scholarly institutions. The myth of locked medieval knowledge begins to seem not merely incorrect, but almost perverse in its misunderstanding of medieval priorities and achievements. The monks and scholars who developed chained library systems weren't hoarding knowledge for selfish purposes, but creating sophisticated institutional structures that successfully preserved European intellectual heritage through one of history's most challenging periods. The gentle rhythm of manuscript preservation and scholarly exchange continued through centuries of political change, religious reform, and social transformation. Each generation of medieval scholars added their own contributions to the growing body of preserved knowledge, while maintaining and expanding the institutional systems that made such intellectual continuity possible. As we drift toward the conclusion of this exploration of medieval myths and realities, the image of the chained library settles into its proper historical context. Those heavy links of iron and brass, far from representing the imprisonment of knowledge, symbolize the careful attention and substantial resources that medieval society devoted to preserving and sharing its intellectual treasures. The chains themselves have largely disappeared, victims of changing technology and shifting institutional priorities, but the manuscripts they protected continue to rest in modern libraries, bearing quiet witness to the dedication of medieval scholars who understood that knowledge, like any precious thing, requires both generous sharing and careful protection. The balance they achieved between access and preservation represents one of medieval civilization's most significant and least appreciated achievements. In the hushed reading rooms, where these ancient books now rest, unchained, but still precious, still consulted by scholars pursuing the same intellectual goals that motivated their medieval predecessors, the gentle correction of historical misconception continues its patient work. The harsh stereotypes of medieval ignorance and institutional selfishness fade away, replaced by recognition of a scholarly culture that successfully maintained and transmitted European intellectual heritage through centuries of challenge and change. The books themselves remain, their pages worn smooth by centuries of careful handling, their margins filled with the accumulated wisdom of generations of readers, their survival testimony to the effectiveness of the preservation systems that medieval libraries developed and maintained with such dedication. In their continued existence, we find the most compelling evidence against the myth of imprisoned knowledge. These texts have reached us precisely because medieval scholars understood that true preservation requires both protection and active use, both institutional security and generous intellectual sharing. As our gentle journey through these corrected medieval myths draws to its close, let yourself settle into the quiet satisfaction that comes from truth patiently revealed. We have traveled together through 4 distinct landscapes of historical misunderstanding, watching as archaeological evidence and careful scholarship have slowly, methodically washed away centuries of accumulated misconception and rising tide smoothing away footprints in sand. The rhythm of this correction process mirrors something deeply comforting about the nature of human knowledge itself. Truth, we have discovered, has a way of emerging through patient accumulation of small details, soap residues in medieval excavations, practical helmet designs in burial sites, astronomical calculations in monastery manuscripts, where patterns on library chains. Each tiny piece of evidence speaks with quiet authority, contributing to a larger understanding that gradually, gently replaces harsh stereotypes with more nuanced appreciation. In the corrected vision of medieval hygiene that we explored first, we found not the filthy masses of popular imagination, but people who understood the connection between cleanliness and health, who developed sophisticated techniques for personal care using the materials available to them, who embedded hygienic practices so deeply into their daily routines that the archaeological record preserves evidence of their attention to cleanliness centuries later. The medieval villager washing her face with herbal-scented soap, the craftsman soaking tired muscles in the communal bathhouse, the noble lady combing precious oils through carefully maintained hair. These images replace the crude caricatures with something more recognizably human, more connected to our own experiences of self-care and daily maintenance. The Viking warriors we encountered in our second exploration proved to be practical professionals rather than the helmeted fantasies of romantic imagination. Their actual equipment, preserved in graves and revealed through archaeological analysis, speaks of sophisticated metallurgy, careful engineering, and deep understanding of combat requirements. The real Viking helmet, with its elegant functionality and balanced design, tells a more compelling story than any harmed fantasy, a story of human ingenuity applied to the fundamental challenge of survival in a dangerous world. Our journey through medieval astronomical knowledge revealed perhaps the most dramatic correction of all. The scholars of the Middle Ages, far from cowering in ignorance before a flat earth, understood perfectly well that they lived on a sphere, had developed sophisticated methods for measuring its size and mapping its surface, and applied this knowledge in countless practical applications, from cathedral construction to agricultural planning. Their manuscripts, instruments, and architectural monuments continue to bear witness to intellectual sophistication that deserves recognition rather than caricature. Finally, the chained libraries that concluded our exploration proved to be not prisons of knowledge, but sophisticated preservation systems, carefully designed to balance access with protection for irreplaceable cultural treasures. The chains that secured precious manuscripts were instruments of conservation rather than oppression, part of institutional structures that successfully maintained European intellectual continuity through centuries of political upheaval and social change. The gentle process of correcting these historical myths offers something more valuable than simple factual accuracy. In discovering that medieval people were more hygienic than stereotypes suggest, that Viking warriors were more practical than romantic fantasies allow, that medieval scholars were more sophisticated than Enlightenment historians imagined, that medieval libraries were more generous than popular culture portrays, we recover something essential about the continuity of human experience across the centuries. The medieval people who emerge from this corrected understanding recognizably our ancestors, not in the crude biological sense, but in the deeper recognition of shared human concerns and capabilities. They cared about cleanliness and health. They understood the importance of practical design over dramatic appearance. They pursued scientific knowledge with sophisticated methods and instruments. They developed institutional systems that balance preservation with access. These are not the concerns of an alien culture, but the familiar preoccupations of people facing universal human challenges with intelligence, creativity, and care. The comfort this provides extends beyond mere historical accuracy to something approaching philosophical reconciliation. The harsh judgments that modernity has passed on its medieval past begin to soften when we understand that those judgments were based on misconceptions rather than evidence. The supposed gulf between medieval ignorance and modern enlightenment narrows when we recognize the sophisticated achievements of medieval science, technology, and institutional organization. This doesn't require romanticizing the Middle Ages or ignoring their genuine limitations and difficulties. Medieval life was certainly challenging in ways that modern life is not. Shorter lifespans, limited medical knowledge, political instability, economic uncertainty. But these challenges were met by people with intelligence and resourcefulness comparable to our own, people who developed solutions that were often surprisingly sophisticated and sometimes remarkably similar to modern approaches. The archaeological evidence that has made these corrections possible continues to accumulate with each excavation season, each manuscript study, each careful analysis of surviving artifacts. The patient work of scholars across multiple disciplines, archaeology, history, art history, scientific analysis, gradually builds a more accurate and more generous understanding of medieval achievement. This scholarly process itself offers something soothing in its methodical approach to truth, its willingness to revise conclusions based on new evidence, its respect for the complexity of historical reality. The myths we have examined tonight didn't persist for centuries because of malicious intent or deliberate distortion, but because they fulfilled psychological needs for later generations. The supposed filth of medieval life made 19th century people feel better about their own hygienic improvements. The romantic fantasy of hardened Viking warriors provided dramatic imagery for nationalist movements seeking heroic ancestors. The myth of medieval flat earth belief allowed Enlightenment thinkers to emphasize the supposed revolutionary nature of modern scientific thinking. The image of knowledge imprisoned in chained libraries supported Protestant criticisms of Catholic institutional practice. Understanding these psychological functions of historical myth-making doesn't diminish the importance of correcting factual errors, but it does help explain why myths persist even in the face of contradictory evidence. People often prefer dramatic narratives to complex realities, simple explanations to nuanced understanding, clear moral lessons to ambiguous historical truth. The patient work of historical correction must compete not only with insufficient evidence, but with the human preference for stories that confirm existing beliefs and satisfy emotional needs. Yet there's profound satisfaction in choosing accuracy over convenience, complexity over simplification, evidence over assumption. The medieval world that emerges from careful scholarly examination proves far more interesting than the crude stereotypes it replaces. Real medieval people, with their sophisticated hygiene practices, practical military equipment, advanced astronomical knowledge, and generous institutional arrangements, offer more compelling subjects for contemplation than the cardboard figures of popular mythology. As we settle into the final quiet of this exploration, let the corrected understanding of these medieval myths carry you toward rest with a sense of historical reconciliation. The harsh judgments that separated us from our medieval ancestors have been gently dissolved by evidence, replaced by recognition of shared human intelligence, creativity, and care. The supposed gulf between medieval darkness and modern enlightenment has narrowed into a more accurate understanding of historical continuity, where each generation builds upon the achievements of its predecessors while facing its own unique challenges. The medieval villager washing with herbal soap, the Viking warrior adjusting his practical helmet, the monastery scholar calculating astronomical positions, the librarian ensuring that precious manuscripts remain both secure and accessible. These figures now stand not as representatives of a benighted past, but as recognizable participants in the ongoing human project of creating lives of dignity, purpose, and intellectual curiosity. In the gentle correction of historical misunderstanding, we find not just better knowledge of the past, but better understanding of the present. The continuities of human experience across the centuries provide comfort in our own efforts to live with intelligence and care, to balance practical necessity with aesthetic aspiration, to preserve valuable knowledge while sharing it generously, to face the challenges of our own time with the same resourcefulness and creativity that medieval people brought to theirs. The archaeological evidence rests quietly in its climate-controlled cases. The manuscripts preserve their careful scripts under protective lighting. The scholarly articles accumulate in academic journals, all bearing patient witness to the slow, methodical process by which truth emerges from the careful study of physical evidence. This process will continue, gradually refining our understanding of the past while offering the deep satisfaction that comes from replacing assumption with knowledge, stereotype with understanding, harsh judgment with generous recognition of shared human achievements across the flowing centuries of our common story. Let this corrected vision of medieval life accompany you into rest, carrying with it the comfort of historical reconciliation and the peaceful recognition that human intelligence, creativity, and care have persisted through all the challenges and changes of our long, shared journey through time.